All right, everybody. Welcome to our second BG Insights videocast. Again, as a reminder, we're doing these 15-minute videocasts to share some of the insights we've learned as we're doing campaigns and running work for our clients in public affairs, higher education, and professional services, as well as our creative group. So every week we're trying to do one or two of these where I bring on one of my very talented colleagues to talk about their space and their work and share some insights with you about how they are managing sort of through the disruption and helping our clients with their campaigns. And with me today is Mike Sherry, who's our Director of Public Affairs and helps run our public affairs practice. Mike's here to talk about his roadmap to project approval, which sounds like a pretty easy roadmap, but as Mike can attest, is not easy at all. And I would encourage those that are here today or listening now to share their LinkedIn profile or ask questions via the chat, which I will moderate, but we should run about 15 minutes or so. And with that said, welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining me today, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Don. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate everybody who took the time out of their day. I know just because we're all locked inside doesn't mean we're not busy, so I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I'll try to be brief but concise. So the topic that I was hoping to speak to you all about today is a roadmap to project approval. And what that means is any kind of development has a process whereby you need to get political support and community support to get the permits and the rezonings and whatever other municipal approvals you need in order to get your project onto the path of construction. So we help developers of all kinds get those things accomplished, even when their projects are controversial or sometimes even disliked initially in the community. So when the coronavirus crisis has ended and permitting and approval processes are back to normal, all kinds of developers are going to be looking for how they need to get their projects approved again. And I'm hoping that this provides a little snapshot of the basic roadmap to what they need to do, regardless of the project, but just general guidelines that everyone should follow. A little bit about me. I am a longtime political campaign consultant and campaign junkie. Managed campaigns for a long time before switching over to the consulting world, where I worked for the Calvert Street Group in Nashville, O'Neill and Associates here in Boston, and now the Belfour Group here in Boston, helping these folks with all kinds of NIMBY issues, development issues, community support, securing approvals, and fighting NIMBY campaigns on behalf of all kinds of projects, ranging from hospitality to real estate to you name it, the sector, any kind of sector that builds something controversial. I've probably had a hand in it one way or the other, trying to get those things approved. I'm now the public affairs practice lead at the Belfour Group, where I work on every developer-related issue that we have here at the firm and some public relations clients as well. The Belfour Group, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure many of you do, we handle all kinds of areas, including higher education, public affairs, professional services, and nonprofits. We do public relations, we do creative work, we do public affairs work like I'm about to talk to you about today, helping individuals and companies and developers get their projects or their policy goals implemented. We have a hand in pretty much every practice area in Massachusetts in terms of every industry, and I'm here to talk to you today about our public affairs work. Just a small sampling of the clients that we've worked with. The developers and municipalities that make up the bulk of our public affairs practice really have a wide variety of issues and needs, and we've been able to help them, whether that's getting their projects approved, whether that's post-approval, working with them to make the construction phase of the process something that works smoothly with the community, or helping them develop economic empowerment zones. This is just a sample of the clients we've worked with. At the end of the presentation, I'd be happy to talk about any of them that you have any questions about. If I've worked on it, some of these are even before my time, but we have other public affairs hands here who've worked with these folks as well. So getting into the topic of today's presentation, I want to speak really briefly about the kind of 3 stages of any development campaign. This is really what the roadmap looks like at the very, very highest level. And that's thinking about your project in terms of pre-launch, launch, and then the decision point. Pre-launch being everything from when you conceive of the project to when you go public with it, public to the community and public to political decision makers. Launch being from when you first really announce the project in a serious public way, all the way up to the decision point, and the decision point being the term that I use for really your final vote, right? And with every project, there are multiple stages of approval, but under most circumstances, there is one key decision point that represents the biggest hurdle, or the turning point in terms of the approvals and the political will that you need to get the project done. So those are the three kind of real stages that I see for any development campaign. And I'm going to take them one by one and dive into what you need to be making sure you do at each one of these. So the pre-launch phase is one of the most important ones, obviously, and that represents the biggest time window you have, because you are not on the clock when you're in the pre-launch phase. You can take as long as you need. Obviously, you have business concerns, but you really have the time to do this right, and I recommend you do. One of the most important things to be focusing on in this phase is a community and economic analysis. And what I mean by that is, economically speaking, you want to make sure your project is positioned to fill a need economically in the marketplace and in the community. And obviously you have a business need to do that. But I also think it's important to make sure that what you're proposing is something that the community either will use or benefit from, because if it's not, that's something that's going to make decision makers tell you to go back to the drawing board. From a community standpoint, you want to take this opportunity to get the lay of the land. Who are the influencers? Who are the civic groups? Who are the stakeholders that really represent public opinion and can sway community opinion in the municipality that you're targeting? And make sure you know who they are. This is research that needs to be done no matter what, so it's best to do it in the beginning when you have the time to make sure you've done it right. In conjunction with your community and economic development analysis, you want to make sure you're understanding and defining what public benefits you're offering. Why should people who aren't going to use your building directly care about it? What does it have to offer for them? Maybe you're giving money to a charitable organization in town. Maybe you are creating an artistic or a cultural benefit that people who aren't necessarily going to be a tenant of the building can still benefit from. You want to define what those public benefits are, and then define what the messaging around them can be. You want to have a tight, very clear, very concise description of all the good things that your project is going to bring, and you want to be able to recite them in your sleep so that when people ask you about it, you can talk about all the good stuff that your project is bringing to town. And then the last thing, you'd be amazed that some people don't really take the time to focus on this, but it's very important. Understanding the public process and the procedure that your project is going to need to take. What hearings will you need to go to? What bodies or committees will you need to be in front of? What permits do you need to win? You'd be shocked at the number of developers who really figure this out on the fly, and sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. And knowing and being prepared in advance for what the public process is going to be is really helpful in this stage as you try to understand how you're going to plan your community outreach, your political outreach, and everything in between. So this pre-launch phase is really your chance to get all your ducks in a row before going public. But sooner or later, you are going to go public, ideally once you've knocked off everything in the pre-launch phase. When you do, there's a couple things you want to make sure you focus on. The first being media relations. Development is not something that gets a ton of day-to-day media coverage of any particular development, at least. Your best chance for a big fanfare of media coverage is when you first announce the project. So take the time to line up with reporters and editors who cover real estate or the community that you're targeting, and give them a sneak peek as to what you're proposing, with the idea that the articles that they'll publish will be viewable by anyone on the day or the day after that you first go public. For many, many people who can't come to your community meetings or won't see your literature, this is the way they learn about the project. So media is really important. Identify who your local and regional media outlets are. Try to get as much coverage as you can in the wind up to the launch. Obviously, post-launch, you're still going to want to try to get media coverage as events happen. And we can obviously talk to you about that all day about how to do that. But that initial launch period is when media relations is probably most attainable and most important. You're also going to want to be focusing on community outreach during this time, and that's everything from individual neighbors to big interest groups to civic groups and neighborhood community groups. Community outreach is probably what's going to take up the bulk of your time in this launch to decision point phase. You're going to want to speak to as many people as possible, and even if you can't satisfy all their wants or their desires or their complaints, making them feel heard is at least half as important as actually being able to accommodate all their requests. So this phase is really where all that research you did in the pre-launch phase about getting the lay of the land for the community pays off, because now you don't need to figure out who do I need to talk to. You know who you need to talk to. You just need to line up. You just need to line up what those conversations, who those conversations are with, and then start having them. The last thing I'll mention in this phase is something that projects more and more have come to focus on, and that's an online presence. Obviously, when your project is approved and you're trying to market it to tenants or to whoever the project is, you want to have a marketing website and a branding website and cultivate social media accounts. But more and more projects are finding success by developing an online presence, even in this approval stage, when they want to just communicate basic facts and information about the project. How much will it cost? What are the benefits to the community? Where can I learn more about it? When's the next public meeting about it, et cetera, et cetera. These are all things that you'll want to put on a basic but functional website. And depending on the size and scale of your budget, you may also want to invest in social media tools to disseminate this information as well. An online presence is not to be confused with an online marketing and branding presence post approval, but even in this stage, it can be very helpful as a supplement to your community outreach. Last stage of this, and probably the most exciting and the one that gets all the headlines, is the decision point, right? This is when all the work you've done from the launch phase up until now really comes to pay off. This is when you leverage all the support you've garnered. So an important stage of that is actually rallying that support. So every conversation, every meeting you've been to, every pledge of support you've gotten, this is when you cash in or check back in with those folks and ask them for their support. It can take the form of writing a letter to the approving body. It can take the form of sending testimony, so to speak, to that body. It can take the form of showing up and speaking in support. A formal endorsement note from an organization is an example of this. But you want to cash in all the goodwill that you've hopefully built up to this point. The process will dictate what that support rallying looks like. For example, there may not even be a public comment hearing where you need to drive people to. In that case, you want to focus everything entirely on letters. But there will be some mechanism for you to showcase the support you've gotten so far, and this is when you really need to cash it in. The other important thing at this point is managing the vote. And by that, I'm talking about the decision makers and the public policy folks who actually are going to be casting a vote on your issue. Ideally, up until this point, you've communicated enough with them and through the media to get a sense of how you think your vote is going to look. And it may be in many cases that it's kind of a close thing. It's a tough thing. In that case, you need to make a decision. Do you want to withdraw the project and wait for a new election cycle when maybe a troublesome counselor or planning board member might be removed? Or do you focus all your efforts on persuasion efforts on those counselors that you think are wobbly or those vote casters who you think are wobbly? These are the kind of decisions that there can't be any general guide to because every case is different. But no matter what, you do want to be thinking about, where do my votes look like? Do I think it's very likely that I'm going to win? You always want to go under the presumption that you're running behind, so fight hard. But if you think after an honest assessment that your vote is in doubt, it's better you have to make a decision as to whether you withdraw, wait for a better body, or you try to focus your persuasion efforts on those votes that you think can be switched. After all of that, you should hopefully have an approved project. There's obviously a lot of steps here, and this is just a very high-level summary of the steps that every project should take. But I found that every successful project, whether they know it or not, tends to follow along this pathway and these guidelines for success. Be happy to answer any questions folks have about this project, about this process, or individual projects in particular that these lessons can apply to. I'll just open it up for anyone who wants to provide any kind of comment at all.
Sure, Mike. We have a few here. First one is, does it matter which community you have worked in? Meaning, is the process the same for urban community like Cambridge versus something that's more out in the burbs, or is the process the same?
Yeah, it's funny because I know some people feel as though if you don't have experience in a particular municipality, then you can't possibly know, oh, our town is so unique and everything about it is special, and so you need to have worked here before to understand it. That's sometimes true, but more often than not, these general principles apply everywhere. Every municipality has a similar process that involves public input, that involves some kind of democratic decision-making process, that involves some kind of formal staff-based body, professional technical body that reviews the technical side of the proposal. So the lessons here apply everywhere. But obviously towns have counselors and planning board members that it helps to know who they are. In that case, you really want to be focusing on the general guidelines that I've outlined here, but don't be afraid to tailor your strategy to the municipality you're in if you have any kind of knowledge or experience of it. But I would say that 75 to
Mm.
80% of the projects I've done have been in towns where I never did it in that town before. But you got to just be able to parachute in, follow the playbook, and understand that the principles apply, even if the specifics change a little bit.
Sure. Obviously, you're working on things now,
Yep.
despite what's going on from a disruption standpoint in COVID. How have things changed or stayed the same with the work you're doing in this space, as as it pertains to what's happening now in society?
So the biggest impact has obviously been on the community process, where face-to-face meetings and attending civic groups and local neighborhood organizations meetings, all those things are on hold. So, excuse me, we've really shifted to much more of an online and phone-based and email-based model where we're contacting the same people we would have contacted, but it's just being done remotely, and it slows things down for sure. But it doesn't mean it's impossible. And anybody who tells you that this process means you can't do community outreach is lying to you. You can absolutely do it. It just means you have to take it in a different, in a perhaps less convenient way than you ordinarily would. It also means that municipalities have put their permitting processes on hold. We're working on a big project in Cambridge right now that has done just that. So the delay in your community outreach because of the inconvenience factor is probably being mirrored right now by the delay in the actual public process. So there's really no excuse not to try to move forward with your project, even under these circumstances.
Sure, sure. Well, it sounds like these projects are they're not easy to win, if you will. Have you ever been in a situation where up to the vote you're feeling 50-50, and what do you do in situations like that?
Yeah, there have been a lot of ones where I felt even worse than 50-50, to be honest, but the economics of the developer meant that they couldn't afford to stop and wait or retool the project, and they just wanted to go forward with it. And sometimes we've been vindicated in that approach. When you do feel like your situation is uncertain and you don't feel that, economically speaking, you can afford to stop, then what you really want to do is just identify, like I mentioned, though that narrow band. There's going to be some counselors that you're never going to get, or planning board members, or whatever the body is. You need to really, really have to take a hard look at who the most gettable of the in doubt decision makers are, and just concentrate all your efforts on them. Have your supporters contact them personally. Find out what their personal pet issues are, and then make
Hmm.
sure to emphasize that messaging in your presentation. There's always
Sure.
ways there's always ways to tailor your pitch to the individual counselors or planning board members or whoever that you think are the most on the bubble.
Mhm. It's funny you mentioned it. I think you touched upon it earlier, but it sounds like it's like these projects are designed almost like a political campaign, get out the vote, if you will. But are there other sort of tactics beyond just traditional PR and sort of grassroots stuff that you have employed to help with these campaigns? I guess from like a digital technology or digital marketing standpoint. And if so, what have you done in the past?
Yeah, I would say probably compared to a traditional campaign, um, you'd be astonished at how much folks communicate over social media these days, and not just to obviously try to secure their vote like you would in a campaign, but to really get a sense of what their issues are and what's important to them, because that informs how you message the public benefits of the proposal you're talking about. So I would say whether it's your development team taking a role directly and asking people online and Twitter, Facebook, what they want to see in a project, or just passively monitoring what people talk about when they first hear about your proposal, that's a great source of information that I don't think developers fully exploit anymore. They don't see what the community actually is saying online. It's a public conversation that anyone can listen to. There in the old days, I'm sure there would have been campaigns and developers that would have killed to have access to that. People's kind of musings about what they think about the project. But we do have access to it. So I would say even just actively or passively listening to what folks say when they hear about the concept of your development can be a really valuable tool.
That's great stuff. Any other questions from the group? Otherwise, any other parting advice you'd leave with our developer friends out there who are listening in now or later as they're watching us, but I want to encapsulate any sort of quick tips or things you want to leave folks with?
Um, I think the number one thing to just be aware of is that projects get approved all the time. I don't want to say every day, but thousands and thousands of projects, across the country every day. There has to be a system to integrate them and take them and get them into the approval get them approved from the government side, there has to be a system that can apply to all of them. But what that means for you is that there has to be a system to match the government system, right? And so don't think that your project has to be, you have to reinvent the wheel. There is a process on the government side, but there's also a process on your side for getting this thing approved. And that involves the things that I just talked about. And if you stick to that, playbook and understand that you are not having to invent a whole process yourself, but rather just slide into according to the system that I've outlined here, hopefully, then you're probably going to save yourself a lot of heartache, and more importantly, you're going to find success at the end of the day. So stick to the plan, follow the procedure, obviously tailor it to your unique circumstances, but don't think you need to reinvent the wheel here. You need to adapt, and you need to follow the playbook. You don't need to rewrite the playbook.
Great stuff. Very good. Well, thanks, Mike, for joining me today on the BG Insights Videocast. For those that are interested in learning more about what we do in this space, please visit thebelfortgroup.com, and you can find Mike on LinkedIn as well, and the Michael Sherry, as well as the Belfort Group in general on social media through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, as well as LinkedIn. So again, Mike, thanks for sharing your insights today, and we look forward to doing the next one pretty soon.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for listening, and I appreciate it.